For those who don't know what UV unwrapping is and what it's used for, here are some examples. For example, I have a 3D model of a cube, and I want to pull this texture over it. And we need to explain to the 3D editor how we're going to pull a 2D texture over a 3D object. So specifically, we can use orthogonal projection. Right now, this window shows the projection of the cube on this surface. And when I move it, the projection changes. You can also see how the position of the texture changes. This way is only good for very flat objects. As you can see, this polygon looks good, but on this one, the texture is very stretched out, and I want to think of a better way. The first thing that comes to mind is to cut this cube and unwrap it. Do you remember how we used to assemble cubes out of paper when we were kids? Now the texture looks much better, and we don't have any distortions. In case of the cube, this method is great because it has flat edges, and we can make seams on the ribs and they won't be very noticeable. But what if we need to unwrap a rounded object, like a sphere? We can try to unwrap it like a globe. We can cut it on one side, but we also have to make many small cuts around the edges. Also, you may notice that the texture is very constricted around the poles, while on the equator, on the contrary, it stretches. And unfortunately, we can't completely avoid the distortion. We can just try different approaches. For example, we can cut the sphere into two parts. There is much less distortion, but it's still there. If you try to flatten the sphere, then these central points will tend to shrink, and the points on the edges will stretch. You can see this effect in viewport. Do you see that? It works like a magnifier. Moreover, we have a seam right in the center of the sphere, and this unwrapping of the image isn't suitable in all cases. Some objects, such as a cylinder, are very easy to unwrap. You can put a cylinder together out of paper, and just like that you can unwrap it back into a flat sheet, and there will be no deformation. Your only problem may be the seam. This topology can be called flat, or I call it cylindrical. The main task of the UV unwrapping is to make as few seams as possible in prominent places, but at the same time to avoid severe deformations. Let's prepare the model for export. First of all, let's remove all the old subtools that we won't need. I still have the old sculpt that we did before retopology, as well as some wheel dummies. I'm gonna delete all of that stuff pretty quickly. Be careful because this operation cannot be undone. Now I want to clean up the grid a little bit. I want to remove these polygons inside because they won't be visible in the render, but it'll make the UV unwrapping harder. In order to do that, I use Z-Modeler in delete mode, and I use polyloop as target. I do the same thing with the laces. Here I don't have any polygroups saved, and the easiest thing to do is to delete these polygons on the edges first. And then already in polyloop mode, remove these polyloops. I do the same with these elements. Here I kept polygroups, so I use polygroup island. In the case of the socks, we've already removed those inner polygons. It'll be very easy to unwrap them. I do the same thing with this bandage. In fact, we can also delete these polygons on the edges here. Also, let's delete the thickness at the jumpsuit. I want to leave only the inner part, the part that fits against the body. If you have polygroups left, as in my case, you can use polygroups island to delete the polygons. But if not, let me show you how to do it. I'll merge everything into one polygroup, and you can use polyloop to delete these loops on the edges. This way you'll separate the outside and the inside. And in order to check, I'll click on Auto Groups. So now you can remove the outer part. And since it's the inner part, the surface normals of the polygons look backwards. If I disable double, you'll see that. And to unwrap them, click Flip. Also, in the last lesson, I forgot to make the wristbands. It's very easy. I copied the body geometry and deleted all except a few poly loops around the wrists. Then I extruded them with Z Modeler and immediately deleted the inner part. This is exactly the same as how I made the headband. I also want to adjust the legs a bit. If you hide the socks, you can see that they don't reach the boots. I'll just move those points around using mask and transpose. And I'll also add a couple of edge loops. I want to add a little more edge loops where the knee will bend. Here I'll just roughly estimate how it'll bend. We aren't going to do any complicated rigging or animation, so it's not that important. But it can help us simplify the task when we put the character into a pose. Now we're all done and ready to export. Go to Z Plugin and find Subtool Master, click Export, then OK. Name it whatever you like and click Save. I'll call it Topology. Now let's open Cinema and in the File menu click Open Project and open the exported OBJ file. I'll leave the default settings. There are a few more things we need to do in Cinema that will simplify the UV unwrapping in 3D Coat. Let's remove this vertex color tag. In Fong tag, delete the angle limits. Also delete the UVW tag. These are just some useless unwraps generated in ZBrush. And delete the material. Now I'm going to inspect the model a little bit for problems. Right now I'm in polygon mode. I've selected all the polygons using the Ctrl or Command A shortcut. Sometimes some normals are reversed, so they may look like this blue color. If you find such polygons, select them and click Reverse Normals. Alternatively, you can use Align Normals just in case. I'll check again. After that, I'll save the scene file just to be sure. I also want to rename the object to Party Maker. We aren't going to make the unwrap for all objects. So before exporting, let's delete the mouth, eyeballs, and hair. Remember that I'm in polygon mode, and I select these parts by clicking twice and on any polygon. Everything else we export to 3D Coat. In order to do this, we go to the File menu, click Export, and we export it as OBJ. I'll name it also Party Maker. Let's open the 3D Coat, and this time select the UV Map Mesh option. Then open the Party Maker OBJ file. Leave the default settings and click OK. In my case, it opens in the wrong mode for some reason. And if you have the same, change Paint to UV in this menu. This mode has two windows. 3D Viewport, in which you can already see the unwrap that 3D Coat has generated automatically. The seams where the geometry is cut are indicated in red. If the seam cuts the piece completely, it's outlined in color. Such pieces are called UV islands. You can click on them in UV Preview to select, and the corresponding parts are highlighted in 3D Viewport. You can move them by moving this circle. The square in the center is responsible for the scale. The texture in Viewport is updated in real time. You can use these sticks to rotate the texture. You can also select the UV island in the viewport. Just click on any polygon, but be careful, as by default the Mark Seams tool is enabled. If you click on the edge, it'll mark it as a seam. To remove the seams, you have to press Ctrl or Command on a Mac and click on it. If you want to select several UV islands, hold down Ctrl or Command on Mac. You can select a texture in this menu to check the deformation. There are a couple of standard options here. If you want, you can upload your own texture. I'll leave the standard checker for now. We can see that the texture is pretty smooth and there's almost no deformations. But the problem is that we have too many seams in prominent places. That's why this automatic unwrapping doesn't work for us that much. Another problem is that, unfortunately, in 3D Coat, we can't select a whole piece of geometry. We can only select UV islands because of the fact that it's cut into such a gigantic number of pieces. It'll be very inconvenient for us to remove and add new seams. So let's remove all of the seams. In order to do this, click Clear Seams on the command menu. As you can see, the unwrapping hasn't changed yet, because the seams are guides for 3D coat, so it knows where to cut the geometry for the unwrapping. Right now, I want to make it so that I have one UV island per solid object, and then it'll be convenient for me to select it. But since we have no seams, we won't be able to unwrap it. And that's why the orthogonal projection will be suitable here. In other words, just flatten them into a surface. Let's select all the polygons. For this, I usually click Clear to make the selection clear, and then Invert, and then click to Planar. The unwrap looks worse now, but in the meantime, we're just making it easier for us to work. I'll clear the selections, and to avoid manually unwrapping these UV islands, use Pack UV. It'll just pack the UV island on that surface. Now if I try to select the body, the whole object will be selected. Notice how disproportionately small it is now. For example, if I select this part, it's clearly too big compared to the body. Click Autoscale and 3D Coat will recalculate the relative size of UV island. Meanwhile, it's a horrible unwrap. You can see it in the deformation of the texture, but it's very handy for me to select different objects. Unluckily, these commands work only with all polygons at once. So, as we'll constantly unwrap and repack these UV islands, we'll be embarrassed to deal with this mess. And in order to simplify our lives, we can divide different parts of the geometry into different UV sets and unwrap them separately. Let's select the geometry of the body. And I also want to select the eye socket and create a separate UV set for them. Now I'll select Add New UV Set in this menu. I'll name it Body and click OK. So when the UV set is created, it should now appear in this menu. You can move the selected polygons into this new UV set. As you can see, it has turned gray. We don't see it in the UV preview. You can switch between these UV sets in the same menu. Here in the Surface Materials tab, you can hide them from the viewport. But as you can see, it doesn't work for the UV set body right now. That's because after any change, you have to click Apply UV Set. This is very important because if you don't save the scene, it'll only save the changes that were made before Apply UV Set. Let's check it now, and we see that everything works. Let's make the first seam in an obvious place. It sounds logical to make a seam here at the junction of the head and body. To avoid selecting the edges one by one, hold down Shift, and then you'll select the edge loop. As you can see, the head is colored differently right away. I'm going to try to unwrap this geometry right away for the sake of an example. You don't have to do that right after you've done one seam. I'll just show this as a demonstration. If you click on Unwrap, 3D Coat will try to unwrap the mesh and spread it out on the surface. As you can see, the body looks absolutely horrible, and here the head looks better already. The 3D Coat just tries to stretch all the seams apart and smooth out everything in between. It's like taking a hat and trying to spread it out on a table into a flat pancake. Also, in the case of a shape as complex as the body, this isn't possible at all. So sometimes if you don't have enough seams and you click Unwrap, the 3D coat can fly out. Be careful. Let's do one more seam. It's logical to make it around the shoulder. Since our mesh is symmetrical, we can use symmetry here too. To do this, press S and turn on the X-axis symmetry. Now we can reflect two arms at once. Let's immediately make the seams around the wrists and cut the legs at the hip area. I'll click Unwrap again to see what happens. The arms and legs obviously have a cylindrical topology. Let's just make seams along their length. And it's best to make them somewhere inside, where you can't see them. I click Unwrap again. And now the topology of the arms and legs looks much better. Next, I want to finish the head. Here you can obviously make a seam around the ear, and also cut it in half, like this. So these two halves are almost plain now. I'll also cut the nose. The nose looks like a cylinder. I'm gonna allow this green ring to unwrap into a stripe and click Unwrap. Let's see what we can do with the head. We could cut it in half, but I don't want the seam to be exactly in the center of the face. I'll cut one edge first. This is probably the place where it's already covered by the hair. Then, if I select Edge Loop, it'll stop at that edge, and I click Unwrap again. Now the head looks significantly better. I want to check right away how the ears have unwrapped. They look great. And these squashed objects are probably the eyelids, and we'll unwrap those later. Let's unwrap the hands. They have a great edge loop that goes all the way through the fingers. I just cut them in two separate halves. Now let's click Unwrap. Let's see how they look. The outer parts are pretty flat and unwrapped perfectly, but the inner ones are quite deformed. You may have noticed that some polygons are bluer and some are redder. This is an indicator of the degree of deformation. The red polygons are too stretched, and the blue, on the contrary, too compressed. And here, it'll be easier to cut off the fingers on the inner part. The inner part is less visible, and in addition, the seams will be hidden by the folds. We still have the body left. It's very easy to unwrap. Here it's logical to make a seam from underarm to thigh and between the legs. Let's click Unwrap. We see that the body unwrapped nicely with a minimal amount of deformation. And in this UV set, we just have the eyelids left to finish. They partially penetrate the head. Let me show you how to isolate one object. Just select them and click Hide. They're now hidden. Thus, click Invert Hidden. However, after that, other UV sets may sometimes appear, but you can just hide them again. The topology of your eyelids may look different, because it's generated by Z-remesher. And in my case, it's a perfect example of bad topology. You see, this edge loop goes in a spiral around the whole geometry. This happens a lot with automatic retopology. Normally, I'd just redo this topology manually. But since our eyelid is small, it won't be seen very much. You can do this without being a perfectionist here. It's quite easy to make a seam here. I'll just select the edge in this corner. That way, I'll cut off half of the loop. Then I'll try to figure out where this loop goes. And it probably comes in here. I'll select the edge here as well. And then I can select the whole loop. All I want to do now is to make seams along the edges of the eyelids. In my case, there are no spirals here. Consequently, I'll just do seams. If in your case there's a spiral, you can either redo the eyelids or use the kind of restrictive edges I showed. At this point, we can unwrap them. After that, you can click Unhide All. Imagine what it would be like if you did an automatic retopology of the whole character. It'd be a lot harder to do the unwrap. Usually, when I've done the seams in all the right places, I choose some texture with long, thin strips. For this, some kind of wood texture might work. I made this one myself in Photoshop. Such a texture helps to better understand the direction of the unwrap. This comes in handy when you're making, for example, an unwrapped clothing, and the orientation of the fabric pattern is important to you. What if, as an example, I want to make that pattern go along the arm? In this case, it doesn't really work, because the retopology of the arm is more like a cone than a cylinder. And you can see how this pattern fits into this seam. We can use the toStrip function for objects with such cylindrical topology. Then they'll rotate into rectangles, and the pattern will go exactly along the polygon loops. This function works only with objects that have all polygon loops parallel and no poles. By the way, these arrows help me understand that the UV island of one hand is reversed. Use clockwise or counterclockwise rotation to rotate in 90-degree increments. So now I have the arrows pointing toward the brush. If you want, you can do the same with the legs. The legs also apparently have a cylindrical topology, and we can use toStrip. After that, I'll rotate the legs so that the arrows look down. If you try to select the fingers and click toStrip, you won't succeed because the fingers have loops that change direction as well as poles. Now I'm going to speed up the video. I'll just rotate all the UV islands to give them some logical direction. For example, I'll just point all the fingers in one direction. Also, the body would logically be rotated vertically, and so on. Therefore, we can pack all the UV islands. Before that, we used Pack UV, but if we click it now, we reset the orientation of some UV islands. I'll undo the changes and use Pack UV2. It does the same thing, but keeps the orientation of the UV islands. If you want, you can click it several times to find the best placement. The other thing I realized was that I wanted to cut off the pants and put them in the UV set with the rest of the clothes. Right now, the shorts and legs are still one solid UV island. And if I click Unwrap, we mess up everything we did before. So I'll select the legs and click To Strip again. Then 3D Coat will automatically cut the selected piece at the new seams. You can also use the 2GU function, which is the same as Unwrap, but it applies to selected objects. And it also cuts at the seams. By the way, there's other Unwrap methods available here. You can try those as well. They simply use a different algorithm. After doing all these things, I'll click Auto Scale and Pack UV2 again. If you're satisfied with the unwrap of this UV set, don't forget to click Apply UV Set. Now I can hide this UV set. If for some reason you don't have the rest of the objects displayed, click Unhide All. Now let's work on the UV set default. I want to split it into two UV sets. Here we have mainly clothes, and we'll have fabric textures. Therefore, it's logical to leave the fabric objects in the same UV set. And if we click Auto Scale, all these objects will have the same size texture. And we can separate everything below the soles into a separate UV set, because it'll mostly consist of plastic. So it's the suspension, the wheels, the brakes, and so on. I'll just select all these objects. Next, I'll create a new UV set and name it Plastic, just as an example. Then I'll send the selected objects to the new UV set. And after that, I'll click Apply UV Set. Next, I'll hide it, and I'll probably rename the UV set default to Cloth. And don't forget to click Apply UV Set. This time, I'll sketch all the seams at once. And after that, I click Unwrap once. I'll cut the bird in half and make the seams on the beak on the edges. The eye can also be cut in half, and the pupil is already flat. This headband is also flat. And it'll unwrap nicely without seams. We can make seams on the jumpsuit just like on the body. I think we can add seams on the straps to cut it in half. The topology here is cylindrical. The socks are also 6 cylinders. We don't have them symmetrical, so we'll have to make seams on both sides. Since we've removed the polygons on the back side on the laces and on this round element, we don't need to make seams. The rainbow stripes are already plain too. I'll just cut them down the center. And I'll cut off the sole of the shoe. And also, I'll make a seam in the back. Let's click Unwrap and see what we got. Everything looks great. Now, since it'll be fabric, I'll change the texture to correct the direction. Some elements, such as this headband, I'll straighten into rectangles with the help of toStrip command. I can do the same with the wristbands. And then I'm going to correct their orientation. Socks also have a cylindrical topology. Thus, I'll select all the socks. And in this case, they'll be easier to select in UV Preview. And then I'll apply toStrip to them as well. So I want the texture to go along these rainbow stripes also. So I'll use toStrip here too. I'll leave the bird as it is. Now we have everything done. And I can click Auto Scale. Then I can click Pack UV2 a few times. If you're pleased with the result, don't forget to click Apply UV Set. Let's now finish the suspension with the wheels. I'll hide everything except the UV set plastic. It's pretty simple here. The wheels have a cylindrical topology. The axles are actually cylinders. I'm going to cut off the circle on the inside of the brakes. And the rest of the part I cut in one seam, like a cylinder. For the suspension, I make seams on the edges, and in my case, one edge is hidden by this cylinder. I select the cylinder and click Hide. After that, I can select this edge. I'm going to cut this purple part to make it into a strip. I click Unhide All and unwrap it. I select all of the wheels and brakes. In this case, it's easy to do in UV Preview. And after that, I click toStrip. I'll also correct the orientation. These circles with a lot of deformations are the hubcaps. These deformed areas are almost invisible and can generally be left as they are. However, if you want, you can cut them as cylinders. I won't use Unwrap so as not to ruin what I already did. So I'll select all these caps and click 2GU. After that, I use auto scale. These are the pieces I probably won't edit because I can't see them anyway, which is why I'll just repack everything by clicking Pack UV2 a few times. I also forgot to send the shorts to the UV set with the clothes. Thus, I'll just select them and click Move Selected to Cloth. After that, I click Auto Scale and repack them again by clicking Pack UV2. The pants have moved into the UV set with the clothes, and you can see that they're deformed, so we need to click Auto Scale as well. And if you want, you can repack and don't forget to click Apply UV Set. I'll check all UV sets again, just to be sure, and click Apply UV Set on all of them. And after that, you can save the scene and export the grid with the finished unwrap. In order to do this, go to File, Export Objects and Textures. Make sure that Export Textures is disabled. We don't need textures. Click on this field and choose where you want to save the file. I'll choose the same folder and name it as PartyMaker UV. Click Save and then Export. Let's open Cinema and import the OBJ file. You can notice that selection sets have been created on the geometry. Their names correspond to UV set in 3D Coat, and they have different materials assigned to them. You can switch Cinema to UV Edit mode, and check how the unwraps look. Right now we have all the UV sets layered on top of each other. To see them individually, just click on these different materials. As you can see, if you've made a good topology, then the unwrapping in 3D Coat is very quick and easy to do.